You don't lose your power all at once. You give it away quietly, in the moments you don't notice. In the instant, you look at a situation and decide, without questioning it, this is just how things are. In the silent agreement you make with fear, with doubt, with limitation long before anything actually happens. That is where it begins. Not outside you, not in circumstances, but in the invisible decision you make about what is possible for you. And the moment you see that, something shifts. Not dramatically, not like a sudden explosion of clarity, but like a subtle crack in a wall you didn't even realize you were living inside. Because if your experience begins with your interpretation, then your interpretation is not fixed. And if it is not fixed, then neither is your reality. You have been living as if life is something you must respond to, as if events come first, and you come second, as if the world moves, and you follow. But that is the inversion. That is the illusion that keeps you reacting instead of creating. Because what you call life is not just what happens, it is what you accept as true about what happens. And that acceptance, that quiet internal agreement, carries more power than any external force you have ever feared. Think about it. Before you speak, there is a thought. Before you act, there is an assumption. Before you experience anything fully, there is already a meaning forming inside you. And that meaning is not passive. It organizes your emotions, directs your attention, filters your perception, and subtly guides your behavior. You are not just observing reality, you are participating in its construction every second. But here is where it becomes uncomfortable. Because if that is true, then it means something very precise. What you are living right now is not random, not entirely. It carries the signature of your inner world, not in a simplistic, blame-filled way, but in a deeper, structural sense. The patterns you see outside, you have roots that run inward, and until you are willing to look there, everything will continue to feel like something that happens to you. This is why most people remain stuck, not because they lack intelligence, not because they lack effort, but because they never question the direction of cause and effect. They try to fix the surface. They adjust behaviors, chase strategies, react to outcomes, while the source remains untouched. And as long as the source remains unchanged, the results will find a way to repeat themselves, even in different forms. Now stay with me here, because this is where the hidden power begins to reveal itself, not as something mystical, not as something unreachable, but as something extremely precise. You are always identifying with something, always, even when you are not aware of it. You are constantly, quietly, telling yourself who you are in relation to your life. I am the one who struggles. I am the one who is unlucky. I am the one who is still trying. These are not just thoughts, they are positions. And once you occupy a position, everything else organizes around it. You don't attract what you want. You align with what you believe yourself to be. And this alignment is not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It happens in the background, in the tone of your inner voice, in the expectations you carry into situations, in the emotional baseline you return to when nothing is distracting you. That baseline, that quiet sense of, this is who I am, is where your power is either activated or suppressed. So when you say you want change, what you are really saying is that you want a different experience. But experience does not begin with action. It begins with identity. And identity is not something fixed, it is something assumed, something you step into, often unconsciously, and then defend as if it were permanent. But what if it isn't? What if the version of you that feels limited is not the truth of you, but just a role you have practiced long enough to believe? What if the boundaries you feel are not walls, but habits of perception repeated so often they appear solid? And what if the power you have been waiting for is not something you need to receive, but something you need to stop ignoring? Because here is the truth most people avoid. You are already using your creative power. You are already shaping your experience. The only question is, are you doing it deliberately, or are you letting old patterns do it for you? Every reaction you have reinforces something. Every assumption you repeat strengthens a pathway. Every time you define yourself, even silently, you are setting a direction. And over time, that direction becomes your reality, not because the world forces it on you, but because you continue to confirm it within yourself. This is why awareness changes everything. Not effort, not force. Awareness. The moment you begin to see your thoughts not as facts, but as choices, you interrupt the automatic. You create space. And in that space, something entirely new becomes possible. You begin to realize that you don't have to agree with every thought that appears. You don't have to accept every interpretation your mind offers. You don't have to carry forward every identity you have inherited from your past. You can pause. You can question. You can choose again. And that choice is where your power lives. Not in controlling the world, not in forcing outcomes, but in deciding what you align with internally. Because once that alignment shifts, the external has no choice but to reorganize. Not instantly. Not magically in the way people fantasize, but inevitably. Because the pattern has changed at its source. So the hidden power within you is not hidden because it is rare. It is hidden because it is constant. It does not turn on and off. It does not wait for permission. It operates whether you understand it or not. And the moment you begin to see that, the game changes. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What am I assuming that makes this feel inevitable?" You stop chasing outcomes and start observing origins. You stop reacting to life and begin to recognize the part of you that is quietly shaping it from within. And that recognition is not the end of something. It is the beginning of a very different way of being. Because once you see it, even for a moment, you can never fully go back to believing you are powerless. You were not born confused about who you are. That came later. It came slowly, quietly, through repetition, through correction, through subtle conditioning that never announced itself as limitation. No one sat you down and told you, "You are small, you are separate, you are powerless." Instead, you were shown a world that behaved as if that were true. And over time, you learned to agree. You learned to identify yourself through reflection, through how others responded to you, through what worked and what didn't, through what was rewarded and what was ignored. You began to build an image not from truth, but from feedback, and that image became familiar, comfortable, predictable. You called it me, without ever questioning where it came from. But that image is not your identity. It is a collection, a structure built from experiences, interpretations, and repeated emotional patterns. And the longer you live inside it, the more solid it feels. The more you defend it, the more you believe it is fixed. Yet beneath that constructed version of yourself, something else has always remained untouched. You have felt it, even if only for a second, in moments when everything goes quiet, when the noise drops, when the tension releases, when you are no longer trying to prove, fix, or become anything. In those rare spaces, there is a different sense of self, not defined, not limited, not reacting, just present, whole, unquestioned. That is not something you created. That is something you forgot. And forgetting does not mean losing. It means overlooking what is still there. You have been living as if your identity is something you must constantly maintain, adjust, and protect, as if who you are is fragile, dependent on outcomes, vulnerable to change. But that version of identity is unstable because it is built on conditions. It rises when things go well, and collapses when they don't. It expands with validation, and contracts with rejection. It is always negotiating, always adapting, always seeking confirmation from the outside. But what if your real identity does not function like that at all? What if it does not need validation because it is not created by opinion? What if it does not shrink under pressure because it is not dependent on circumstances? What if it does not need to be improved because it is not broken to begin with? You have been taught to think of yourself as someone moving towards something, someone trying to become better, stronger, more successful, more worthy. And there is nothing wrong with growth, but the assumption behind it is rarely questioned. The assumption that you are incomplete now, and that completion lies somewhere in the future. That assumption is the root of the forgetting, because if you believe you are incomplete, you will search endlessly. You will chase versions of yourself that always seem just out of reach. You will measure your value based on progress, comparing who you are to who you think you should be. And in doing so, you reinforce the idea that what you are right now is not enough. But the identity you forgot does not operate in time. It is not something you grow into. It is something you recognize, something that has been present before every version of you have ever tried to become, before you learned your name, before you understood expectations, before you started defining yourself through success and failure. There was an awareness, simply being, not trying to be better, not trying to be anything, just existing without conflict. That awareness did not disappear. It became covered by layers of thought, layers of belief, layers of emotional memory, each layer reinforcing the idea that you are separate, that you are defined by your past, that you must earn your place in your own life. And over time, the layers became so dense that you stopped noticing what was underneath. But the truth has not changed. Only your attention has. You are not the story you repeat about yourself. You are the one repeating it. And that difference changes everything. Because the moment you see that your identity is not the story, but the awareness behind the story, you begin to loosen the grip of everything you thought was fixed. You begin to see that what you have been defending is not your essence, but your interpretation. And interpretations can change. This is why so many people feel stuck. Not because they cannot change their circumstances, but because they believe their identity is tied to those circumstances. They say, "This is just who I am," without realizing that what they are calling who I am is actually what I have experienced. You are not your past. You are not your patterns. You are not your limitations. Those are expressions that have been repeated, not definitions that are permanent. And the more you identify with them, the more you give them continuity. But identity, in its truest form, is not something you inherit. It is something you assume, not through effort, not through force, but through recognition, through the quiet shift of seeing yourself differently, not because something external changed, but because you are no longer willing to agree with what is false. You don't become your higher self. You stop pretending you are something smaller, and that shift is subtle. It doesn't require dramatic action. It doesn't demand that you fix everything at once. It begins in the way you observe yourself, in the way you respond to your own thoughts, in the way you choose what you agree with internally, because every time you accept a thought like, "I am not enough," you are reinforcing an identity, not because it is true, but because you are giving it authority. And every time you question it, every time you refuse to fully agree, every time you step back and see it as just another passing construction, you weaken its hold. You don't need to destroy the old identity. You need to stop feeding it. And as you do that, something else begins to emerge. Not something new, but something familiar. Something that feels like clarity instead of effort, like stillness instead of tension, like certainty without needing proof. That is the identity you forgot, not because it left you, but because you stopped looking from it. And the more you return to that perspective, the less convincing your limitations become. Not because they disappear instantly, but because they lose their authority. They stop defining you and start appearing as temporary expressions within a much larger field of awareness. So the question is no longer, who am I trying to become? The question becomes, what have I been pretending to be? And once you begin to see that clearly, the entire structure of your identity starts to shift, not through force, but through truth, because what is real does not need to be created. It only needs to be remembered. There is a moment you have seen before, maybe without realizing how much it reveals. A child sitting at the edge of the shore, hands buried in wet sand, completely absorbed in building something that, to an outside observer, looks fragile, temporary, almost meaningless. A castle shaped from grains that will not hold, walls that will not last, towers that lean slightly under their own weight. And yet, watch the child closely. There is no doubt in them, no hesitation, no question about whether it is real enough or worth doing. In that moment, the child is not reacting to the world. The child is creating within it, and then the wave comes. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't negotiate. It rises, rolls forward, and in a matter of seconds, everything the child built is gone. The shape dissolves. The structure disappears. The carefully formed edges return to formless sand. If you were to stand there and judge the scene from the outside, you might say, it's over. It's destroyed. All that effort, gone. But the child doesn't see it that way. The child pauses, looks, and then begins again. Not because the castle survived, but because the idea did. This is where you need to pay attention, because what you just witnessed is not a simple moment of play. It is a direct expression of something you have forgotten. The child is not attached to the form, because the child knows without needing to explain it that the form is not the source. The source is within. The castle is not the creation. The idea of the castle is, and that idea has not been touched by the wave. You, on the other hand, have been taught the opposite. You have been trained to believe that when something disappears in your external world, it is gone. When a situation collapses, when a plan fails, when something you built falls apart, you interpret that as loss, as final, as proof that something didn't work, or worse, that something is wrong with you. You attach your sense of identity to the form, and when the form breaks, you feel broken with it. But what if the form was never the source? What if everything you see around you, the results, the circumstances, the visible structures of your life are only expressions, not origins? What if they are the sandcastle, not the idea behind it? And what if the idea, the true creative impulse, remains untouched no matter what happens on the surface? Because this is the shift you have been avoiding. Not consciously, but through habit. You have learned to measure reality by what you can see, touch, and confirm externally. You have learned to treat the visible as truth, and the invisible as secondary. But the child reverses that order naturally. The child knows, without needing to articulate it, that the visible is temporary, that it can change, collapse, be reshaped, and none of that affects the capacity to create again. Now look at your own life through that lens. How many times have you stopped yourself, not because you lost the ability to create, but because something didn't appear the way you expected? How many times have you taken a single outcome and turned it into a conclusion about what is possible for you? How many times have you let one wave define your willingness to build again? You didn't lose your creative power. You lost your trust in it. And that loss of trust did not happen because something outside of you became stronger. It happened because you shifted your attention. You began to look at the sandcastle and forgot about the mind that built it. You began to evaluate the result and stopped recognizing the source. And over time, you started to believe that the result was everything and the source was uncertain. But the source has never been uncertain. Only your awareness of it has. Right now, as you sit here, you are still creating, not in some distant, mystical sense, but in a very immediate and continuous way. Every assumption you hold, every expectation you carry, every image you repeat internally, they are shaping the framework through which you experience reality. You may not see the full result instantly, just as the child does not see the castle fully formed in the first handful of sand, but the process is already in motion. This is what creative consciousness really means. Not that you can control every detail of the external world, but that you are the origin point of the patterns that unfold within it. That what you consistently imagine, feel, and identify with becomes the blueprint that reality organizes around. The child doesn't doubt this process. The child doesn't stand there thinking, "What if the sand doesn't listen to me?" The child acts from an assumption of natural alignment. Of course, the sand will take shape. Of course, the idea can become visible. The only question is how it will be expressed this time. You, however, hesitate, not because you lack the same capacity, but because you have layered your mind with conditions. You have added rules. You have built a system where creation must be justified, validated, proven before it is trusted. And in doing so, you have distanced yourself from the very mechanism that has always been operating within you. But here is what you need to see clearly. The wave does not invalidate the creation. It only removes the current form. And if the form is not the source, then nothing essential has been lost. This is why your setbacks feel heavier than they actually are. Because you are not just responding to the event, you are interpreting it as a statement about your ability to create. You are turning temporary changes into permanent conclusions. You are saying, "It didn't work," when what really happened is that version didn't remain. But you are still here. The source is still here. The idea is still available. The capacity has not been reduced. So what changes if you begin to see your life the way the child sees the sandcastle? What changes if you stop measuring your power by what remains and start recognizing it by what can be recreated? What changes if you understand that nothing external has the authority to define what is possible within you? Because once you see that, something loosens. The pressure to get it right the first time fades. The fear of losing something softens. The need to control every outcome begins to dissolve. And in its place, a different kind of confidence emerges, not loud, not forced, but steady. The confidence of knowing that no matter what disappears, you can create again. And that confidence does not come from blind belief. It comes from recognizing a pattern that has always been there. You have created before. You have imagined, assumed, reacted, and shaped experiences countless times, not always consciously, not always deliberately, but consistently. So the question is not whether you are capable of creation. The question is whether you are willing to return to it without fear of the wave, because the wave will always come. Forms will always shift. Situations will always change. That is not something you control. But what you do control, what you have always controlled, is the source from which new forms arise. And that source has never left you. You were never meant to understand that phrase the way you were taught. Made in the image of God was not written so you could imagine a distant figure and try to resemble it. It was never about appearance, never about form, never about copying something external. And yet, that is how it has been reduced into symbolism that feels poetic but distant, powerful but unreachable. But if you stay with the words, not as belief, but as something to be examined, something begins to open, because image, in its true sense, is not about how something looks. It is about how something functions. If you are made in the image of something, you are not being told that you look like it. You are being told that you operate like it. And this is where everything changes, because what defines what you call God, beyond religion, beyond doctrine, beyond interpretation, is not form. It is creation. The ability to bring something into expression from something unseen, to originate, to project, to move from idea into experience. That is the essence. That is the defining characteristic. So if you are made in that image, then creation is not something you occasionally participate in. It is what you are always doing, not just when you are intentional, not just when you are trying to manifest, but constantly, quietly, through the structure of your awareness itself, through the way you perceive, interpret, assume, and identify. Because before anything exists in your outer world, it passes through you as a concept, as a meaning, as an internal agreement. You don't just observe reality, you give it form, and the moment you begin to see that, the phrase stops being abstract. It becomes precise. It becomes uncomfortable. Even because it means that you are not separate from the process. You are not standing outside, waiting for something to happen. You are inside the mechanism, influencing it from the only place it can actually be influenced, within your own consciousness. But here is where most people hesitate, because to accept that you are made in the image of a creative force means accepting responsibility for what you create, not in a way that blames you for everything, but in a way that removes the illusion that you are powerless. And that illusion has been comfortable. It has allowed you to explain things, to justify patterns, to accept outcomes without questioning their origin. If you are not the source, then you don't have to look inward. You can keep searching outward, adjusting circumstances, reacting to events, hoping something changes. But if you are the source, even partially, then something deeper is required. Awareness, honesty, a willingness to see what you have been participating in without realizing it, because creation does not begin with action. It begins with identification. You are always identifying with something. A role, a belief, a story about who you are and how life works for you. And once you identify with it, you begin to think from it, feel from it, expect from it. It becomes your position, and from that position, everything else organizes. You don't need to force reality to change. You need to shift the position from which you are perceiving it. This is why two people can live in the same world and experience completely different lives, not because the world treats them differently, but because they are not relating to it from the same identity. One moves through life as if opportunities are available. The other moves as if they are rare. One expects support. The other expects resistance. And over time, those expectations do not just remain internal, they begin to shape what is encountered externally. This is not coincidence. It is alignment. And alignment is not something mystical. It is the natural result of consistent internal orientation. What you repeatedly assume becomes familiar. What becomes familiar becomes believable. What becomes believable becomes expected. And what you expect, you begin to notice, to respond to reinforce. So, when you hear that you are made in the image of a creative force, it is not telling you that you have potential. It is telling you that you are already participating in creation whether you realize it or not. The question is not if you are creating. The question is how consciously you are doing it, right now. You may still feel like life is something that happens to you, that events arrive, and you respond. That circumstances define your options, but if you look closer, you will begin to notice patterns, repeating dynamics, familiar emotional cycles, similar outcomes appearing in different forms, and those patterns are not random. They are reflections of something stable within you, something you have been identifying with long enough that it feels natural. But natural does not mean permanent, because identity is not fixed. It is assumed, and assumption is not passive. It is active. It is creative. The moment you accept something as true about yourself, you begin to operate from it. You begin to filter reality through it. You begin to align your thoughts, your feelings, your expectations with it. And over time, that alignment shapes your experience so consistently that it appears as if the world itself is confirming it. But the world is not confirming you. It is reflecting you. This is why the idea of being made in the image of God has been misunderstood, because people hear it as something distant, something symbolic, something to admire. But it is not meant to be admired. It is meant to be recognized as a description of how you function. You do not need to become a creator. You need to realize you already are one. And that realization does not come through effort. It comes through observation, through noticing the connection between what you consistently hold within and what you repeatedly encounter without, through seeing how your inner dialogue shapes your outer interactions, through recognizing that your expectations are not neutral, they are directional. Once you begin to see that clearly, something shifts, not externally at first, but internally. You stop waiting for permission. You stop looking for confirmation. You begin to understand that the power you have been searching for is not something you access occasionally. It is something you are always using, and that changes the way you relate to everything. You become more aware of what you are agreeing with internally, more selective about the identities you occupy, more conscious of the narratives you repeat, not because you are trying to control every thought, but because you understand that what you consistently return to becomes the foundation of your experience. This is not about perfection. It is about awareness, because the moment you see that your consciousness is not just observing life but shaping it, you can no longer pretend that your role is passive. You begin to see yourself differently, not as someone trying to survive the world, but as someone participating in its formation, and from that place, something deeper becomes possible, not because the world suddenly changes, but because you do. You didn't fall the way you think you did. There was no moment where something pure was suddenly taken from you. No instant where you were pushed out of something sacred into something broken. The fall was quieter than that. It was not an event. It was a shift in attention, a movement so subtle that it went unnoticed, yet powerful enough to change the entire way you experience yourself and the world. Because unity is not something you see. It is something you are. And the moment you stop being aware of it, it feels like it disappears. At first, there was no separation, not because everything looked the same, but because nothing was interpreted as separate. There was no distance between what you experienced and what you were, no division between observer and observed. Life was not something happening to you, it was something moving through you, as you, without resistance, without judgment, without the need to define or control. But then something changed, not outside you. Inside you, you began to look, and instead of simply experiencing, you started to interpret. You started to name, to label, to compare. You began to say, "This is me, and that is not me. And in that moment, a line was drawn, invisible, but real in its effect. A boundary between what you identify with and what you perceive as external. That boundary is where limitation begins. Because once you see yourself as separate, everything changes. The world is no longer an extension of your being. It becomes something you must navigate, something you must understand, predict, control. You begin to feel exposed, vulnerable to forces outside your influence. And from that feeling, new patterns emerge: fear, desire, resistance, the need to protect what you call self from what you call other. And slowly, without realizing it, you move from participation into reaction. This is what the fall really is. Not a punishment, not a loss of worth, but a shift from unity into identification with separation, a narrowing of awareness, a contraction of perspective. You go from being the space in which experience happens to being a character inside it. And once you become the character, everything feels more intense, because now every event is personal. Every outcome carries meaning about who you are. Success lifts you. Failure diminishes you. Approval validates you. Rejection questions your value. You begin to live inside a constant evaluation of yourself, measuring your worth based on what happens around you. But this measurement is based on a misunderstanding, because the self you are protecting is not your essence. It is your interpretation. You are not reacting to life. You are reacting to the version of yourself you believe you are within it, and that belief is fragile, because it is built on conditions. It depends on outcomes, on feedback, on consistency. It needs reinforcement, and so you begin to seek it. You look for confirmation that you are enough, that you are safe, that you are in control. And when that confirmation is not there, you feel unstable, so you try to fix it. You adjust your behavior. You chase better results. You try to improve your circumstances, thinking that if the outside becomes stable, the inside will follow. But it doesn't, because the instability did not come from the outside. It came from the shift in awareness. You forgot that you are not just in the experience. You are the one through which it is being interpreted. And the moment that is forgotten, limitation feels real, because if you are only the character, then you are subject to the script. You are bound by what has already happened. You are defined by your past. You are limited by your environment. You become something that must adapt instead of something that can create. This is why patterns repeat, not because life is forcing them on you, but because you are relating to life from the same identity. You are seeing through the same lens. You are interpreting from the same position. And as long as that position remains unchanged, the experience will continue to reflect it. You don't need new circumstances. You need a different point of awareness. But that is not easy to see, because the separation feels so real. The distance between you and what you want feels tangible. The gap between where you are and where you think you should be feels fixed. And so you begin to operate from lack, from effort, from trying to bridge that gap through action alone. But the gap itself is created by perception. You are not separate from what you seek. You are only seeing it as separate. And that distinction changes everything. Because if separation is a product of awareness, then it can be undone by awareness, not by force, not by pretending everything is perfect, but by recognizing where the division is being created, by noticing how often you define yourself in contrast to your desires, how often you say, "I am here, and what I want is there." How often you reinforce the idea that what you seek is outside your reach. Every time you do that, you deepen the sense of separation. And the deeper the separation feels, the more effort you believe is required. But what if the effort is not the solution? What if the solution is the recognition that the separation is not real in the way you think it is? Because the moment you stop identifying solely as the character, something shifts. You begin to see that you are also the awareness observing the character, the space in which the thoughts arise, the presence in which the emotions move, and from that place, the intensity softens. You are no longer trapped inside every reaction. You can see it, and in seeing it, you create distance not from life, but from the identification that was limiting your perception of it. This is not about escaping the world. It is about changing how you relate to it, because the fall into limitation did not remove your power. It obscured it, and what is obscured can be revealed, not by becoming something new, But by remembering what you stop noticing, you are not separate. You have been seeing through separation. And the moment you begin to recognize that, even slightly, the structure of limitation starts to loosen. Not because the world changes instantly, but because the way you are relating to it is no longer the same. And that is where the return begins. Nothing in your life appears out of nowhere, even though it often feels that way when you only look at the surface. You see the moment something becomes visible, when it finally takes shape in the world. And you call that the beginning. But it isn't. By the time anything reaches your external reality, it has already been forming inside you for a while, quietly, without needing your attention, without announcing itself. And because you were never taught to look there, you learn to treat life as something unpredictable, something that arrives without warning, something you can only respond to after it happens. But that is only true if you ignore the place where everything actually begins. Your mind is not just a place where thoughts come and go. It is not a random stream of images and reactions that you have to tolerate or manage. It is a field, a living environment, something far more structured than you have been led to believe. It behaves like a garden, and whether you realize it or not, you are always planting something in it, not occasionally, not only when you are intentional, but constantly. Every thought you repeat, every assumption you accept, every inner conversation you allow to continue without interruption is being planted somewhere within you. And once it is planted, it does not remain inactive. A thought is never just a thought. It is a beginning. It carries direction. It carries structure. It carries the potential to become something more than what it seems in the moment. And just like a seed placed into soil, once it enters your awareness and is given attention, it begins to develop. You may not see it immediately. You may not notice anything changing on the outside. But something is already in motion. The process has already started. And it does not require your constant awareness to continue. This is why your life can sometimes feel disconnected from your intentions. You say you want one thing, but you experience something else, and it feels confusing, even unfair, as if reality is not listening to you. But what you are experiencing is not only what you consciously choose in a single moment, it is the result of what you have consistently allowed to take root over time. Some of those seeds were planted deliberately, but many were not. They were absorbed from your environment, from past experiences, from repeated emotional reactions, from beliefs you accepted long before you knew you could question them. And over time, they settled into the soil of your mind and began to grow. What grows inside you does not stay inside you. It shapes how you see. It shapes what you expect. It shapes how you interpret situations before you even fully experience them. And because your perception is shaped, your reactions follow. Your decisions follow. Your patterns follow. And eventually, your external reality begins to mirror the structure that has already been established within you, not in a simple or mechanical way, but in a way that is consistent enough that if you look closely, you can begin to see the connection. But most people never look there. They focus on action. They believe that results come from what they do, from effort, from strategy, from external movement. And while action matters, it is not the origin. It is the extension. Before any action is taken, something has already been assumed. Before any decision is made, something has already been accepted as possible or impossible. Before any path is chosen, there is already a direction forming within the mind. You do not act randomly. You act from what feels true to you, and what feels true to you is not always what is actually true. It is what has been repeated long enough that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like reality itself. But it is not reality. It is a pattern that has grown from the seeds you have been planting, consciously or unconsciously. Over time, this is where your awareness becomes important, because the garden does not stop growing when you stop paying attention. It continues. Whatever has been planted continues to develop, continues to spread, continues to influence the entire landscape of your inner world. And if you do not choose what you plant, something else will fill the space. Old fears, familiar doubts, repeated limitations. They will settle in and grow because they have already been given time and attention before. Neglect is not neutral. If you leave the garden unattended, it does not remain empty. It becomes overgrown. And after a while, That overgrowth begins to look normal. It begins to feel like this is just how things are, as if the conditions you are experiencing are fixed, as if they are part of your identity, as if nothing can really change. But what you are seeing is not permanence. It is cultivation, and anything that has been cultivated can be cultivated differently, not by force, not by trying to erase everything at once, but by understanding what is already there and deciding what you will continue to give your attention to. Because attention is what nourishes growth. What you return to again and again becomes stronger. What you dwell on becomes familiar. And what becomes familiar begins to feel true, even if it started as something small and insignificant. So if you continue to revisit the same thoughts of doubt, the same fears about what might go wrong, the same quiet assumptions about what you are capable of, you are watering them. Even if you say you don't want them, you are giving them life through repetition. And over time, they begin to dominate your internal landscape, not because they are inherently powerful, but because they are consistently reinforced. But the same principle works in the opposite direction. You can choose what you plant next, not in a forced or artificial way, not by pretending that everything is already perfect, but by introducing a different kind of thought, a different kind of assumption, and then returning to it with consistency. Because consistency is what allows a seed to take root. It is not intensity. It is not effort. It is repetition without resistance. You do not need to control every thought that appears in your mind. That is not realistic, and it is not necessary. Thoughts will come. Some of them will reflect old patterns. Some of them will feel automatic. But what matters is not what appears. It is what you agree with, what you allow to stay, what you continue to revisit until it becomes part of your internal environment. You are not responsible for every thought that enters your awareness, but you are responsible for what you cultivate within it. And the moment you begin to see that clearly, you are no longer trapped inside your mind. You are no longer reacting to every thought as if it defines you. You begin to observe them, to recognize them as options, as seeds that can either be planted or left alone. And in that observation, there is space. Space to choose something different. Space to redirect your attention. Space to begin shaping your inner world with intention instead of habit. And that inner world does not remain hidden forever. What grows within you will eventually express itself. Not all at once. Not in a sudden transformation. But gradually, naturally, as the patterns stabilize, as the new assumptions become familiar, as the new way of seeing becomes the way you automatically return to. The garden does not rush, but it does not stop, and neither do you. You don't experience life directly, you experience yourself in relation to it. And that difference is so subtle that most people never question it. Yet it shapes everything. Because before anything happens to you, before any situation fully unfolds, there is already a quiet position inside you. A way you see yourself in that moment. A sense of who you are in relation to what is about to occur. And that sense, that silent identity, is what determines how you perceive, how you respond, what you expect, and ultimately, what you allow to unfold. This is what your self-concept really is. Not a label you consciously choose. Not a description you casually repeat, but a living structure inside you. A blueprint that organizes your entire experience. It is the lens through which you see the world. But more importantly, it is the position from which you move through it. And because it operates so quietly, so consistently, it begins to feel like reality itself, as if things are simply the way they are, when in truth, they are the way they appear to you based on who you believe yourself to be. You might say you want success, connection, freedom, abundance, but what you experience will always be filtered through the version of yourself you have accepted as true. Because you do not move toward what you want, you move from who you are. And if who you are internally does not align with what you say you desire, there will always be tension, always resistance, always a gap that feels impossible to close no matter how much effort you apply. This is why people can do all the right things and still feel stuck. They can follow strategies, take action, push themselves beyond comfort, and yet the results remain inconsistent or temporary. Not because they are doing something wrong on the surface, but because the blueprint underneath has not changed. They are trying to build a different life while still identifying with the same version of themselves. And the structure cannot hold. It collapses back into what feels familiar, into what has been reinforced long enough to feel natural. Your self-concept is not something you switch on and off. It is something you live from. It is present in every interaction, in every decision, in every reaction. It is there in the way you interpret a delay, in the way you respond to uncertainty, in the way you talk to yourself when no one else is listening. It is not what you say once, it is what you consistently assume without questioning. And that assumption is powerful, not because it is loud, but because it is stable. You might not even notice it. But you are always placing yourself somewhere in relation to your life. You are either the one who expects things to work out, or the one who prepares for disappointment. You are either the one who feels supported, or the one who feels alone. You are either the one who believes opportunities are available, or the one who assumes they are limited. And once you take that position, everything else begins to organize around it. You don't need to force the world to match you. It naturally aligns with the identity you consistently occupy. This is why your external reality can feel so convincing, because it appears to confirm what you already believe about yourself. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, you will notice every obstacle, every delay, every challenge, and each one will reinforce that identity. If you see yourself as someone capable, supported, and aligned, you will notice opportunities, openings, and possibilities, and those will reinforce a different identity, the same world, the same circumstances, but a completely different experience, all shaped by the blueprint you are living from. And the most important thing to understand is this: your self-concept is not fixed. It feels fixed because it has been repeated. It feels real because it has been reinforced. But it is not permanent. It is assumed. And what is assumed can be reassumed, not through force, not through pretending, not through trying to convince yourself of something you do not believe, but through a gradual shift in what you choose to identify with. Because every time you agree with a thought about yourself, you are strengthening a position. Every time you repeat a narrative, even silently, you are reinforcing a structure. And over time, that structure becomes so familiar that it feels like truth. But familiarity is not truth. It is repetition. And if repetition created your current identity, repetition can reshape it. This is where most people misunderstand the process. They think change comes from action alone, from doing more, from trying harder, from pushing through resistance. But action without alignment only creates temporary results. Because as long as your internal identity remains the same, you will continue to return to it. Just like water returning to its natural level. You cannot outwork a self-concept that contradicts what you are trying to create. You must change the level from which you are operating. And that change does not begin with what you do. It begins with what you accept as true about yourself. It begins with noticing how you speak to yourself, how you define yourself in quiet moments, how you interpret your experiences, how you position yourself in relation to your desires. Because those small, consistent patterns are not insignificant. They are the blueprint. If you continue to see yourself as someone who is trying, you will remain in the state of trying. If you continue to see yourself as someone who is not there yet, you will continue to experience distance. If you define yourself through lack, through struggle, through limitation, even subtly, even unconsciously, you will continue to align with that pattern. But the moment you begin to shift your self-concept, even slightly, something begins to change. Not instantly in the external world, but internally, in the way you perceive, in the way you respond, in the way you expect. You begin to move differently, not because you are forcing yourself to act differently, but because you are no longer seeing yourself the same way. And that shift in perception naturally leads to a shift in experience. You stop waiting for proof before you believe. And you begin to understand that belief itself is what shapes what you will eventually experience. You stop defining yourself by your past, and you begin to see that your past was only an expression of a previous identity, not a definition of what is possible now. And as that understanding deepens, the blueprint begins to change, not because you are trying to become someone else, but because you are no longer holding on to a version of yourself that was never fixed to begin with. You don't create a new life by forcing new outcomes. You create a new life by becoming a different version of yourself internally and allowing everything else to reorganize around that shift. And once you see that clearly, you stop asking, "How do I get what I want?" And you begin to ask a different question entirely. Who am I being that makes this my reality? There is a phrase you have been using your entire life without ever pausing to understand what you are actually doing when you say it. It slips out of you so naturally, so automatically, that it feels harmless, almost invisible, yet it carries more weight than any action you take, more direction than any plan you make, more authority than anything you have ever been taught to control. That phrase is simple: I am. And the moment you add anything after it, you are not just describing yourself, you are defining the position from which your entire reality begins to organize. You say it constantly, often without awareness. I am tired. I am stressed. I am not ready. I am behind. I am not good enough. And because it feels like a simple observation, you do not question it. You assume you are just telling the truth, just reacting to what you feel in the moment. But what you are actually doing is something far more precise. You are taking the most powerful statement of identity available to you and attaching it to a temporary condition, then repeating it until it becomes familiar, until it feels stable, until it begins to shape how you experience yourself and everything around you. I am is not just language. It is alignment. Before anything else appears, before any role, any emotion, any circumstance is identified, there is already awareness. There is already presence. There is already the sense of existence itself. And that sense, that simple recognition of being, is what I am points to. Not a role, not a label, not a condition, but the fact that you exist before anything is added to it. That is the foundation. That is the origin. But you rarely stay there. Almost immediately, you complete the sentence. You define it. You narrow it. You turn something infinite into something specific, something fixed, something that can be measured and compared. And the moment you do that, you move from pure awareness into identification. You step into a position, you declare, even silently, "This is who I am." And from that point, everything begins to organize itself around that declaration. You do not need to repeat it out loud for it to work. It is enough that you accept it internally. It is enough that you feel it, that you agree with it, that you return to it again and again until it becomes your default reference point. Because once something becomes your reference point, it begins to influence how you see, how you interpret, how you expect. It becomes the lens through which your entire experience is filtered. This is why the words that follow "I am" matter more than you realize. Not because you need to monitor every sentence, not because you need to control your speech perfectly, but because you need to understand what is happening when you identify with something. You are not just describing your state, you are reinforcing it. You are not just acknowledging a feeling, you are giving it structure. You are not just reacting, you are aligning. And alignment, once established, does not stay isolated. It spreads. If you say, "I am overwhelmed," you do not just feel overwhelmed in that moment. You begin to notice everything that supports that identity. You interpret situations through that lens. You respond in ways that confirm it. You reinforce the pattern, not intentionally, but naturally, because your perception has shifted. And over time, what started as a momentary feeling becomes a familiar state, then a repeated experience, then something that feels like a permanent part of who you are. But it was never permanent. It was repeated. And what has been repeated can be redirected. This is where your awareness becomes critical, because you cannot stop the fact that you are always saying "I am" in some form. Even when you are silent, there is a quiet identity running in the background, a sense of self that you are operating from. The question is not whether you are using this creative statement. The question is what you are attaching to it. Because whatever you attach to "I am," you step into, not metaphorically, but experientially. You begin to think from it, feel from it, act from it, expect from it. It becomes your position, and from that position, your reality begins to align, not instantly, not in a dramatic transformation, but gradually, consistently, in ways that become more noticeable over time. This is why trying to change your life without changing what follows I am often feels exhausting. You are trying to create new outcomes while still identifying with the same limitations. You are saying, I want something different. But internally, you are still saying, I am the same. And as long as that contradiction exists, the deeper pattern will always pull you back to what feels familiar. You cannot consistently experience what you do not identify with, and you cannot fully identify with something new if you continue to reinforce the old. So the shift does not begin with forcing new behaviors. It begins with noticing what you are already declaring about yourself. It begins with becoming aware of the subtle, automatic ways you define yourself throughout the day, not just in obvious statements, but in quiet assumptions, in internal reactions, in the way you interpret your experiences. Because every time you say, even silently, I am the one who struggles, you are reinforcing a structure. Every time you think, I am always behind, you are strengthening that identity. Every time you accept a limitation as part of who you are giving it continuity. But the same mechanism can work in a different direction. You can choose what you attach to I am, not by denying your current experience, not by pretending something is not happening, but by refusing to turn temporary conditions into permanent identities, by recognizing that what you are experiencing is not what you are. By separating the state from the self, you can say, I am aware of this challenge, instead of I am the one defined by it. You can shift from identification to observation, from attachment to awareness, and in that shift, something opens, space appears, the rigidity softens, because when you stop locking yourself into a fixed identity, you regain flexibility. You regain the ability to move, to redefine, to align differently, and as you begin to consciously choose what follows I am, not perfectly, not constantly, but consistently enough, something changes. Your internal dialogue shifts. Your emotional baseline shifts. Your expectations begin to reorganize. And as that happens, your external experience starts to reflect that new alignment, not because you are forcing it, but because you are no longer contradicting it. I am is not a statement you use occasionally. It is the foundation you are always standing on. And once you begin to see that clearly, you stop using it carelessly. You stop attaching it to everything that passes through you. You begin to recognize that you are not here to describe yourself based on what has already happened. You are here to define the position from which what happens next will emerge. And that position is always chosen. Whether you realize it or not, you have been confusing what you are going through with who you are. And that confusion has been shaping your entire experience without you even realizing it. It happens so naturally, so quickly, that it feels like truth instead of interpretation. A situation appears, a feeling arises, a pattern repeats, and almost instantly, you turn it into a definition, not something temporary, not something passing, but something personal, something that belongs to you, something that becomes you. You don't just say, this is happening. You say, this is me. And that is where the distortion begins. Because there is a difference, one so subtle that it is often ignored, between identity and condition. A condition is something you are experiencing. It moves. It shifts. It changes over time. It can appear, intensify, fade, and disappear. It is not fixed. It is not permanent. But identity is what you believe yourself to be. It is what you return to when nothing else is distracting you. It is the position you hold, consciously or unconsciously, as your truth. And the moment you attach a condition to your identity, you freeze something that was meant to move. You take something temporary and give it continuity. You take something that could pass and make it stay, not because it has the power to define you, but because you are giving it that power through agreement. You say, I am anxious. Instead of noticing that anxiety is something you are feeling in this moment, you say, I am broke. Instead of recognizing that you are currently experiencing a financial situation, you say, I am unlucky. Instead of seeing a series of outcomes that you have interpreted in a certain way, and with each of those statements, you are not just describing what is happening, you are defining who you are. And once something becomes part of your identity, it begins to organize your entire experience. You start to think from it. You start to expect from it. You start to filter everything through it. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to live in alignment with that definition, not because it is true in an absolute sense, but because it has become familiar. It has become your reference point. It has become the lens through which you see yourself and the world. This is why breaking patterns feels so difficult. Not because the patterns are inherently strong, but because they have been tied to your identity. You are not just trying to change a situation, you are trying to change who you believe yourself to be within that situation. And as long as those two are connected, every attempt to change will feel like resistance, like conflict, like something you have to fight against. But you are not meant to fight your conditions. You are meant to see them clearly, because the moment you separate identity from condition, something shifts. The weight begins to lift. The pressure begins to dissolve. You are no longer trapped inside what you are experiencing. You are no longer defining yourself through something that was never meant to define you. You can say, "This is something I am going through," instead of, "This is who I am." And that distinction, simple as it sounds, changes the entire structure of how you relate to your life. Because when you stop identifying with the condition, you stop reinforcing it. You stop feeding it with attention. You stop giving it stability. You allow it to move, to change, to lose its grip on your perception. And as that happens, your experience begins to shift, not because you forced it, but because you are no longer holding it in place through identification. This is what it means to break false labels, not by rejecting your experience, not by denying what is happening, but by refusing to turn it into a permanent definition, by recognizing that what you feel, what you face, what you encounter, does not have the authority to tell you who you are. Because who you are is not something that changes with every situation. It is something that remains, even as situations change. But you have been trained to look at your life and draw conclusions about yourself from it. You have been taught to evaluate your worth based on outcomes, to define your identity based on results, to see your circumstances as evidence of who you are. And over time, those conclusions have become so familiar that they feel unquestionable. You say, "This always happens to me," as if repetition proves identity. You say, "I've always been this way," as if history defines possibility. You say, "That's just who I am," as if identity is something fixed and unchangeable. But none of those statements are truths. They are agreements. Agreements you have made with patterns that have been repeated long enough to feel permanent. Agreements that you continue to reinforce every time you return to them without questioning. And what you agree with, you continue to experience. So the question is not how to escape your conditions. The question is whether you are willing to stop identifying with them, because as long as you see yourself through the lens of limitation, you will continue to align with it. You will continue to notice it, expect it, respond to it, and reinforce it, not because you want to, but because it has become your default way of seeing. But the moment you begin to observe instead of identify, you interrupt that cycle. You create distance not from your life, but from the labels you have placed on yourself within it. You begin to see that your thoughts about yourself are not facts. Your interpretations are not definitions. Your past is not a fixed identity. It is a series of experiences that you have given meaning to, and meaning can change. You are not here to carry every label you have ever accepted. You are not here to define yourself by what has already happened. You are not here to repeat the same identity simply because it feels familiar. You are here to recognize that identity is something you are constantly assuming, and what you assume becomes your reality. So if you want something different, the shift does not begin with changing what is happening. It begins with changing what you are calling yourself within what is happening. It begins with removing the labels that have been limiting your perception, with refusing to define yourself through temporary conditions, with choosing to see yourself as something more than the patterns you have been repeating. Because you are not your condition, you have been identifying with it, and the moment you stop doing that, even slightly, the structure that held it in place begins to loosen. And something else becomes possible not because the world changed, but because you are no longer the same within it. There are moments when everything feels divided. When life seems to split itself into fragments, you have to manage. This is good. That is bad. This helps you. That blocks you. This is yours. That belongs to someone else. And in the middle of all that separation, you place yourself as something small trying to navigate something large. That way of seeing has become so familiar that you rarely question it. Yet it is not the only way you can experience reality. It is simply the way you have been conditioned to perceive it. Because what you call your mind is not just a thinking machine reacting to the world. It is a lens, and depending on how that lens is set, everything changes. Not the events themselves, not the outer forms, but the meaning they carry, the way they affect you, the role you believe you play within them. Most of the time, your lens is tuned to separation. You see yourself as an individual entity, isolated within a field of external forces, trying to control what you can and defend against what you cannot. And from that perspective, life becomes a negotiation, a constant balancing act between what you want and what you fear. But there is another lens, one that does not divide experience in the same way. It does not remove contrast, but it removes the sense of disconnection. This is what has been called the mind of Christ, not as a religious concept to believe in, but as a state of awareness to recognize, a way of perceiving where you are no longer standing apart from life, but are aware that everything you experience is unfolding within the same field of consciousness that you are part of. You are not outside looking in, you are inside, and everything is moving through the same space. At first, this may sound abstract, but you have already touched this state before, even if only briefly, in moments where you were fully present, where you were not caught in judgment or resistance, where you were not dividing everything into categories of right and wrong, success and failure, gain and loss. In those moments, something felt different, not because the world changed, but because you were not relating to it in the usual way. There was less tension, less urgency to react, less need to define everything immediately. That is not a coincidence. That is a glimpse of a different level of awareness. The difficulty is that you do not stay there. You return quickly to interpretation, to labeling, to deciding what something means for you, and as soon as that happens, the division reappears. You are back inside the pattern of reacting, evaluating, protecting, trying to control outcomes based on how they affect the version of yourself you are identifying with in that moment. But what if you did not rush to that interpretation? What if, even for a moment, you allowed yourself to see without immediately defining? Because the mind of Christ does not eliminate thought, it changes the relationship you have with it. It introduces a pause, not a forced pause, not something you have to struggle to maintain, but a natural space that appears when you are no longer completely identified with every thought that arises. In that space, you begin to see something clearly. What is happening is not the same as what you think about what is happening, and that distinction gives you freedom, because once you see that your interpretation is not absolute, you are no longer trapped inside it. You can observe it, question it, allow it to pass without turning it into a fixed meaning. You are no longer pulled immediately into reaction. You are aware of the reaction, but you are not defined by it. This is where unity begins, not as a concept, but as an experience. You stop dividing everything into opposing forces, and you begin to see that what you are experiencing is not separate from the consciousness through which you perceive it. The problem is not something entirely outside you. The emotion is not something happening to you. The situation is not an isolated event disconnected from your awareness. Everything is part of the same field, and you are not a spectator in it. You are participating in how it is interpreted and experienced. From this place, your sense of control changes. You are no longer trying to force outcomes or manipulate circumstances to feel secure. Instead, you begin to see that your real influence lies in how you perceive, how you interpret, how you align internally before you act externally. And because of that, your actions become more precise, more grounded, less reactive. You are not trying to fix everything at once. You are seeing clearly enough that your response naturally shifts. This is why operating from separation feels exhausting. You are constantly reacting to fragments, constantly trying to manage pieces that seem disconnected from each other. But when you begin to perceive from unity, even slightly, the need to control everything begins to soften. You realize that not every thought needs to be followed. Not every emotion needs to be acted on. Not every situation needs to be immediately defined. You begin to trust your awareness more than your reactions, and that trust creates stability. Not the kind of stability that comes from everything going your way, but the kind that comes from not being shaken by every shift in your external world. You are still aware of what is happening, but you are no longer overwhelmed by it. You are still engaged, but not entangled. And from that place, your creative power becomes clearer, because you are no longer creating from confusion, from fear, from fragmented perception. You are creating from a level of awareness that sees more completely, that is not limited by immediate reactions, that is not trapped inside old patterns of interpretation. You begin to recognize that your experience is not something you are separate from, but something that is continuously shaped by the way you perceive and respond. This is not about becoming someone else. It is about seeing from a place you have been overlooking, because the mind of Christ is not something you acquire over time. It is something you access the moment you stop identifying completely with the divided way of seeing you have been practicing. It is available in every moment where you choose awareness over reaction, observation over judgment, presence over automatic interpretation. And once you begin to recognize that, even briefly, the structure of how you experience life begins to shift, not because you changed the world, but because you are no longer seeing it through the same lens that once kept everything separate. You don't notice the law when everything feels random, when outcomes seem disconnected, when life looks like a sequence of events you are trying to manage as they come. But the moment you begin to look beneath the surface, not for explanations, not for excuses, but for patterns, something starts to reveal itself, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet consistency that becomes harder to ignore the longer you pay attention, because what you call coincidence begins to repeat, what you call chance begins to organize, and what you thought was unpredictable begins to follow a structure. There is a law operating here, whether you recognize it or not a law imposed on you, not something external that decides your life, but something intrinsic to the way consciousness and experience interact. And this law does not depend on belief. It does not require your approval. It operates the same way whether you understand it or ignore it. Whether you use it deliberately or unconsciously, the law of mind is simple in its essence, but not always easy to accept. What you consistently hold in awareness tends to organize your experience, not instantly, not in a linear cause and effect that you can trace moment by moment, but in a deeper, more structural way. What you return to, what you dwell on, what you accept as true enough times that it becomes familiar, begins to shape how you perceive, how you respond, how you expect, and over time, those internal patterns begin to align with what you encounter externally, not because the world is bending to your will in a simplistic way, but because your perception is no longer neutral. It is directional, and direction, when maintained, becomes outcome. But this is only one side of the equation, because if there were only mental law, everything would feel unstable, as if your thoughts alone could create anything without structure, without coherence, without balance. That is not how reality operates. There is another layer, something that holds everything within a broader movement, something that does not depend on your personal patterns, something that maintains order even when your awareness is scattered. This is what can be called divine order, not as a concept to worship, not as something distant and untouchable, but as the underlying intelligence that moves life toward coherence, toward harmony, toward a kind of unfolding that, even through disruption, carries direction. You may not always recognize it, especially when things do not go the way you expect. But if you look carefully, you will begin to see that even what feels like disorder is not without structure. Things resolve, patterns complete, cycles move. There is a tendency within life to reorganize itself, to move toward balance, to bring what is out of alignment back into some form of coherence. And this movement does not come from your individual thinking alone. It exists beyond it. Yet it interacts with it constantly. This is where most people become confused. They either believe that everything is controlled externally, that they have no real influence, or they believe that everything is controlled by their thoughts alone, as if they exist in isolation from a larger system. But neither of those views is complete. You are not separate from the order that governs life, and you are not powerless within it. You are participating in it. Your mind provides direction. Divine order provides structure, and your experience emerges from the interaction between the two. This is why not every thought manifests immediately. This is why not every desire appears the moment you think it. Because what you hold in awareness is not operating in a vacuum. It is moving within a larger field that maintains balance, timing, and coherence beyond your immediate perception. But this does not reduce your power. It refines your understanding of it. Because if you begin to see this clearly, you stop trying to force outcomes, and you begin to align with process. You stop expecting instant results as proof of truth, and you begin to recognize patterns over time. You stop reacting to temporary appearances as if they define everything, and you begin to trust that what is unfolding is not random, even when you cannot yet see the full picture. This is where patience stops feeling like waiting and starts feeling like alignment, because you are no longer trying to control every step. You are holding a direction internally, allowing it to stabilize, allowing it to become natural, allowing it to integrate into the way you think, feel, and respond. And as that internal alignment strengthens, your external experience begins to reorganize in ways that may not always be predictable, but are consistent with the direction you have established. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. A single thought, held briefly, does not carry the same influence as a pattern repeated over time. It is not about how strongly you think something once. It is about how often you return to it. Because repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates belief, and belief creates expectation, and expectation shapes perception, and perception shapes experience. This is the chain, not mechanical, not rigid, but reliable enough that once you see it, you can no longer pretend that your inner world has no influence on your outer life. But there is another aspect you must understand, because this is where people often misapply this law. They try to control every thought. They try to eliminate anything negative. They try to maintain a constant state of positivity, as if any deviation will disrupt everything. And in doing so, they create tension. They create resistance. They turn awareness into effort. That is not alignment. That is control. And control comes from the same place as fear, the belief that if you do not manage everything perfectly, something will go wrong. But the law does not require perfection. It requires direction. It requires awareness of what you are consistently holding on to, not obsession with every passing thought. Because thoughts will come and go. Some will reflect old patterns. Some will feel automatic. That is not the problem. The problem is what you choose to return to, what you reinforce, what you allow to become familiar. You do not need to fight your mind. You need to understand how it works. And once you understand that your thoughts are not isolated events but part of a larger pattern, you begin to treat them differently. You stop reacting to them impulsively. You begin to observe them, to notice which ones you are feeding, which ones you are repeating, which ones are shaping your baseline. And as you shift what you consistently return to, something begins to change, not immediately in every external detail, but internally, in your sense of direction, in your emotional stability, in your expectation of what is possible. And that internal shift begins to influence everything else. Gradually, naturally, as your awareness and the larger order of life begin to move in alignment, this is not something you control. It is something you cooperate with, because the law of mind gives you the ability to choose your direction, and divine order ensures that what you align with is not lost, not ignored, but integrated into the unfolding of your experience in ways that extend beyond what you can see in a single moment. And when you begin to live with that understanding, something changes. You stop chasing results as proof. You start recognizing alignment as the cause. You don't notice how loud your inner world has become until, for a brief moment, it stops. And in that pause, something unfamiliar appears. Something so simple that it almost feels empty, yet at the same time, strangely clear. Not because something new was added, but because something constant was no longer covering everything else. That is the moment most people miss, because they rush back into thinking, back into interpreting, back into the movement that feels like control but is actually noise. Your mind has been trained to stay active, to comment, to analyze, to anticipate, to replay, to prepare. It moves from one thought to another without rest, building chains of interpretation that feel necessary, even productive. But if you watch closely, most of that movement is not creating clarity. It is reinforcing confusion. It is repeating patterns, recycling emotions, looping through the same conclusions in different forms, and because it never stops, you have learned to trust it, to follow it, to assume that if you are thinking, you are understanding. But thinking is not always understanding. Sometimes it is avoidance, because as long as the mind is busy, you do not have to face the silence beneath it. You do not have to confront the absence of constant definition. You do not have to experience yourself without the familiar structure of interpretation, and that absence feels uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because it is unfamiliar. You have been identifying with movement for so long that stillness feels like loss, but it isn't. It is the first place where you are not being pulled. Every thought that arises carries a direction. It invites you to follow it, to engage with it, to build on it. And if you follow every thought, you never stay in one place long enough to see clearly. You are constantly moving, constantly shifting, constantly reacting. One moment leads to another. One interpretation leads to another. And before you realize it, you are no longer aware, you are carried. This is why discipline is not about forcing the mind into silence. It is about not following everything that appears, because you cannot stop thoughts from arising, but you can stop yourself from being taken by them. You can notice without continuing. You can observe without building. You can let something pass without turning it into a narrative that defines your experience. And at first, that feels unnatural. You will notice how quickly the mind wants to fill the space, how fast it jumps in with commentary, how easily it pulls you back into familiar patterns. It will feel like you are losing something, like you are not doing enough, like you should be thinking, solving, preparing. But that impulse is part of the conditioning. It is the habit of movement trying to reassert itself. You are not losing control. You are stepping out of automatic control, because most of what you have been calling control is actually reaction happening so quickly that it feels intentional. You think you are choosing, but you are following. You think you are deciding, but you are repeating. And until you slow down enough to see that, nothing changes. The shift begins in a small moment. A thought appears, and instead of continuing it, you see it. That's all. You don't fight it. You don't push it away. You don't replace it. You simply see it as something that has arisen, not something that must define you. And in that seeing, there is a gap, a space that did not exist before. Because before, you were inside the thought. Now, you are aware of it. That space is where everything changes, because in that space, you are no longer being shaped unconsciously. You are not reinforcing the pattern. You are not giving it more momentum. You are allowing it to exist without feeding it. And when something is not fed, it weakens not immediately, not completely, but gradually, as it loses the repetition that kept it alive. This is how silence begins, not as an absence of thought, but as an absence of participation. And as you remain there, even briefly, something else becomes noticeable. A steadiness that was always present but overshadowed. A kind of clarity that does not come from thinking more, but from thinking less compulsively. You begin to perceive without immediate distortion, to experience without constant commentary, and that changes the way you move through everything, because when you are not reacting automatically, your responses become deliberate, not forced, not calculated, but aligned with a deeper sense of awareness. You are no longer pulled into every emotional shift, no longer defined by every passing thought, no longer trapped inside the same loops that once felt unavoidable. You begin to choose, not from pressure, but from presence, and presence does not need to rush. This is where most people misunderstand discipline. They think it requires effort, control, strict rules about what should or should not be thought. But true discipline is lighter than that. It is not about restriction, it is about recognition. Recognizing when you are being pulled, recognizing when you are repeating, recognizing when you are no longer aware, and each time you recognize, you return, not to a state you create, but to one that was always there. The more you do that, the less convincing the noise becomes. Thoughts still arise, but they do not carry the same weight. Reactions still appear, but they do not take over. The patterns that once felt automatic begin to lose their grip, not because you destroyed them, but because you stopped feeding them with constant attention. You don't silence the mind by force. You outgrow the need to follow it. And in that shift, Something stabilizes within you, not a rigid stillness, not an absence of life, but a grounded awareness that remains even as everything else moves. You are no longer searching for clarity through more thinking. You are allowing clarity to emerge when thinking is no longer dominating everything. This is not something you achieve once and hold forever. It is something you return to, again and again, in small moments, in quiet pauses, in the choice to not follow what once pulled you automatically. And over time, those moments connect. They become more frequent, more natural, less forced, until one day, without needing to mark it, you realize that what once felt like effort has become your baseline, and the noise that once defined your experience is no longer in control. You have been approaching prayer as if it were something you do occasionally, a moment you step into when you feel the need to ask, to hope, or to seek support. But that way of seeing it has kept you at a distance from what it actually is, because prayer was never meant to be a request sent outward, waiting for something beyond you to respond. It is a deliberate act of alignment, a structured movement of consciousness in which you shift from reacting to what is visible into embodying what is not yet seen. And the difference between those two positions determines whether you remain bound to circumstances or begin to influence them from their origin. The misunderstanding begins the moment you separate yourself from what you are seeking. Because when you ask from a place of distance, when you feel that what you desire exists somewhere outside your reach, somewhere you must wait for, earn, or be granted access to, you are already reinforcing the very separation that prevents it from stabilizing in your experience. And no matter how many words you repeat or how sincere your intention feels, that underlying position continues to shape the outcome, not because you are doing something wrong, but because you are aligning with absence while trying to create presence. What changes everything is not the intensity of your desire, but the level from which you engage it. Because creation does not begin when something appears in the external world. It begins when a state is accepted internally as real enough to be lived from. And that acceptance does not come through effort or force. It comes through a shift in awareness that allows you to step into the experience of already being aligned with what you once thought was separate from you. This is why the first movement in what can be called scientific prayer is not speaking, not imagining, not declaring, but withdrawing your attention from what is already formed. Because as long as you remain fixed on the problem, on the lack, on the visible evidence of what is not yet changed, you are feeding the very structure you are trying to move beyond. And no new alignment can stabilize while your awareness is still anchored in what has already been created. You must, even briefly, step back from that fixation, not by denying it, but by no longer allowing it to dominate your perception. From that shift, a different kind of clarity begins to emerge. And in that clarity, you define not in the sense of describing what is currently happening, but in the sense of declaring what is true at a deeper level of identity. Because the act of saying "I am" is not a casual statement. It is a placement of awareness, a decision about where you stand in relation to your own life. And whatever you attach to it becomes the position from which your experience begins to organize itself. When you say "I am whole," I am supported, I am already aligned with what I seek, you are not attempting to convince yourself of something that is not true. You are choosing to step into a state that exists beyond immediate appearance and allowing your awareness to stabilize there. And the effectiveness of this does not come from repetition alone. It comes from the degree to which you are willing to accept that position without contradiction, without constantly returning to the old identity that was built on absence. But words alone are not enough, because if the declaration remains intellectual, if it stays at the level of language without being felt, it does not penetrate deeply enough to shift your baseline, which is why the next movement is not about thinking harder, but about allowing yourself to feel the reality of what you have declared, not in an exaggerated or forced way, but in a quiet, a natural recognition that what you are aligning with is not foreign, not distant, but something you are now choosing to inhabit. This is where imagination becomes functional rather than escapist, because you are no longer using it to fantasize about a future you hope to reach. You are using it to experience, internally, the state you are claiming as already true. And as you remain there, as you return to it consistently, as you allow that state to become familiar, something begins to shift in the way you perceive everything else. Because your expectations adjust, your reactions soften, your interpretation changes, and the external world, which once felt fixed, begins to reorganize in ways that reflect this new internal alignment. The final movement is where most people lose trust, not because it is difficult, but because it requires a different kind of understanding, and that is release. Because once you have aligned internally, once you have defined and felt the state you are choosing to live from, there is nothing more to force, nothing more to control, nothing more to constantly check. And yet the mind, conditioned by habit, will want to return to doubt, to questioning, to looking for immediate proof. And in doing so, it pulls you back into the old position before the new one has had time to stabilize. Release does not mean forgetting what you have chosen. It means not interfering with it, not contradicting it, not undoing it through repeated doubt. Because what you have established internally does not need constant reinforcement through tension. It needs consistency without resistance, a steady return to the same alignment without urgency, without pressure, without the need to see immediate results as validation. And this is where patience becomes something entirely different from waiting. Because you are not sitting in uncertainty hoping something will happen. You are maintaining a direction that has already been set, trusting that what has been aligned within you is not lost simply because it is not yet visible, understanding that creation moves through stages, and that what has been accepted at one level must integrate before it fully expresses at another. When you begin to live from this understanding, prayer is no longer something separate from your daily experience. It becomes the way you engage with your own consciousness continuously, because every assumption you hold, every identity you accept, every state you return to is part of the same process. And the only difference is whether you are participating in it deliberately or allowing it to unfold unconsciously through patterns you have never questioned. At that point, something becomes unmistakably clear, not as a belief, but as a direct recognition. You are not reaching for something outside of you. You have been positioning yourself away from it. And the moment that position changes, the entire structure of your experience begins to shift in response. Not because something external has decided to grant your request, but because you are no longer standing in a place that denies what you are capable of becoming. You have been using imagination your entire life, but not in the way you think, not as a tool to create, but as a habit to rehearse what you fear, what you doubt, what you expect to go wrong. And because it feels automatic, because it feels like just thinking, you have never questioned the role it plays in shaping what you eventually experience. You imagine conversations before they happen. You imagine outcomes before they unfold. You imagine limitations before you even test what is possible. And each time you do that, you are not preparing yourself, you are positioning yourself, placing your awareness into a version of reality that has not yet occurred, but is already beginning to organize itself around the state you are holding. This is why imagination cannot be treated as something trivial, because it is not a distraction from reality. It is a rehearsal of it, a space where you step into an experience before it becomes visible. And the more you return to that experience, the more familiar it becomes, until eventually it no longer feels like something imagined. It feels like something expected, something natural, something that aligns with who you believe yourself to be. And once something reaches that level of familiarity, your perception, your reactions, your decisions begin to shift in subtle ways that guide you toward that outcome, not through force, not through control, but through alignment. But most of the time, you are imagining from the wrong position. You are imagining toward what you want instead of from it, which means you are placing yourself in the role of someone who does not yet have it, someone who is still waiting, still reaching, still trying to get there. And that position carries a hidden message that you may not even notice. It is not mine yet, and as long as that message is present, no matter how vividly you imagine, no matter how strongly you desire, you are reinforcing distance instead of dissolving it, because your imagination is not neutral. It is directional, and the direction you choose determines the state you occupy. Living from the end is not about visualizing an outcome as something you hope to experience one day. It is about stepping into the state where that outcome is already part of your identity, where it is no longer a goal but a condition of being. And that shift is not external. It does not require anything to change outside of you first. It requires a change in where you are standing internally, in how you relate to what you say you want, in whether you continue to see it as separate from you or begin to experience it as already yours at the level where creation begins. This is where imagination becomes precise rather than vague, because you are no longer thinking about what could happen. You are experiencing what has already happened from the inside, not in a forced or exaggerated way, but in a quiet, natural recognition that if this were true, if this were already part of your life, how would you feel? How would you think? How would you see yourself? And once you enter that state, even briefly, you begin to notice that it carries a different kind of stability, a different kind of certainty that does not depend on external confirmation. At first, your mind will resist this, because it is conditioned to look at what is visible as the only valid reference point. And when you step into a state that is not yet reflected outside of you, it will try to pull you back, to remind you of what is currently happening, to show you reasons why this is not real, why this is not possible, why you should wait for proof before you accept it. But that reaction is not truth. It is habit. It is the momentum of old patterns trying to maintain their position. And if you follow that resistance, you return to the same place, the same identity, the same expectations that have been shaping your experience up to this point. But if you remain in the new state, if you allow yourself to feel it without immediately questioning it, something begins to shift, not in the external world right away, but in your internal alignment, in the way you respond to situations, in the way you interpret what happens, in the way you carry yourself through your day. You begin to notice that you are no longer reacting from lack, no longer thinking from absence, no longer expecting delay or difficulty as your default. And this does not require effort. It emerges naturally because you are no longer seeing yourself as someone who is trying to get somewhere. You are seeing yourself as someone who is already there. And from that position, your actions become different. Your decisions become different. Your presence becomes different. And those differences begin to shape your experience in ways that cannot be explained by external factors alone. Living from the end is not about ignoring reality. It is about redefining it at the level where it is formed, because what you see outside is not the beginning. It is the result. And if you continue to treat it as the source, you will always feel like you are reacting to something fixed. But when you shift your attention to the internal state, to the position you are occupying in your own awareness, you begin to understand that what is visible is not final. It is responsive. It is influenced by what you consistently hold within you. This is why repetition matters, not as a way to convince yourself, but as a way to stabilize a new state until it becomes familiar, until it feels natural enough that you no longer have to remind yourself to return to it, until it becomes the place you automatically stand from. And once that happens, the distance between imagination and experience begins to collapse, not because you forced it, but because you are no longer contradicting it. You do not need to imagine all day. You do not need to control every thought. You only need to return, consistently, to the state that represents what you have chosen, and allow that state to become your baseline. Because once it is your baseline, everything else begins to align with it. Not perfectly, not instantly, but inevitably, because you are no longer divided between what you want and who you believe yourself to be. And when that division disappears, something becomes clear in a way that does not need explanation, because you are no longer imagining to escape your current reality. You are imagining as the act of creating the one that is already waiting for you to step into it. You speak all day, but most of what shapes your life is never said out loud. It happens in the quiet layer beneath your voice, in the sentences you repeat to yourself without noticing, in the tone you use when you describe your situation, in the subtle declarations you make about who you are and how life works for you. And because these words feel private, because they are not heard by anyone else, you assume they do not carry weight. Yet they are the very structure your experience begins to organize around. Because language is not only a way to communicate what is happening, it is a way to define what will continue. Every time you describe something, you are not just reporting it, you are reinforcing it. You are giving it shape, giving it continuity, giving it a place in your internal world where it can settle and become familiar. And once something becomes familiar through repetition, it begins to feel true, not because it is objectively fixed, but because you have returned to it often enough that it no longer feels like a choice. It feels like reality itself. And this is how most people unknowingly build the patterns they later struggle to change. The words you use carry direction, even when they seem casual, even when they feel harmless, because the mind does not separate between what you say seriously and what you say just because. It responds to repetition, to consistency, to the emotional tone behind what is being expressed. And if you continue to describe yourself through limitation, through delay, through struggle, even in subtle ways, those descriptions begin to stabilize into identity. And once they reach that level, they no longer feel like something you said. They feel like something you are. You might think that only strong declarations matter, that only intentional affirmations have power. But the truth is far more precise than that. Because what shapes your experience is not what you say occasionally. It is what you return to consistently, what you repeat without resistance, what you allow to settle into your internal language until it becomes the default way you relate to yourself and your life. And this is why someone can say something positive once and feel no change, while continuing to repeat subtle negative patterns all day without realizing they are reinforcing the very structure they want to move beyond. Your inner dialogue is not neutral. It is formative. It is the ongoing declaration of your identity in real time. And every sentence you complete internally is another placement of awareness, another alignment with a certain version of yourself, another reinforcement of a pattern that will eventually shape how you perceive, how you respond, and what you experience. Because you do not live in the world as it is. You live in the world as it is filtered through the language you use to define it. This is why two people can face the same situation and walk away with completely different experiences. Not because the situation changed, but because the meaning they gave it was different. And that meaning was shaped by the language they used internally, by the way they described what was happening, by the identity they reinforced in that moment. Because the moment you say, "This always happens to me," you are not just expressing frustration. You are defining a pattern. You are placing yourself in a position where repetition becomes expected, and expectation begins to guide perception until you continue to see evidence that confirms what you have declared. But the same mechanism that reinforces limitation can also be used to create expansion, not by forcing words that feel disconnected, not by repeating phrases you do not accept, but by becoming aware of how you are already speaking and choosing, deliberately, to shift the direction of those declarations, to stop reinforcing what you do not want and begin stabilizing what you do, not in a way that denies your current experience, but in a way that refuses to turn it into a permanent identity. When you say, "I am learning to handle this," instead of, "I am terrible at this," you are not ignoring the challenge. You are redefining your position within it. And that shift, even though it seems small, changes how you move forward, because you are no longer reinforcing limitation as identity. You are aligning with growth as a process, and that alignment begins to influence your perception, your effort, your persistence in ways that gradually reshape your experience. Declarations are not about exaggeration. They are about alignment, about choosing words that reflect the direction you are willing to move in, and then returning to those words consistently until they become natural, until they no longer feel like something you are trying to say, but something you are living from. Because once a declaration becomes part of your identity, it no longer requires effort to maintain. It becomes the place you operate from without needing to remind yourself. This is why saying "I am" is never neutral, because whatever follows it is not just a description. It is a decision, a placement of identity that begins to influence everything else. And if you are not aware of what you are attaching to it, you will continue to reinforce patterns that feel automatic, patterns that seem difficult to break, not because they are strong in themselves, but because they are consistently supported by the language you use internally. You do not need to monitor every word you speak. That would only create tension. But you do need to become aware of the patterns that repeat, the phrases that come up again and again, the way you describe yourself when you are not paying attention, because that is where your real declarations are happening. Not in the moments when you are trying to be intentional, but in the moments when you are simply being yourself, as you currently understand it. And as you begin to notice those patterns, you create the opportunity to shift them. Not by force, not by rejecting everything you have been saying, but by gradually introducing a different direction, by choosing words that align with the version of yourself you are willing to become, and returning to them consistently enough that they begin to feel familiar. Because familiarity is what transforms language into identity, and identity is what shapes your experience. You are not trying to convince the world to change. You are allowing your internal language to stabilize into a form that no longer contradicts what you want to experience. And as that happens, your perception begins to shift. Your reactions begin to change. Your expectations begin to align. And what once felt distant begins to feel possible. Not because you forced it into existence, but because you are no longer reinforcing the opposite through unconscious declaration. At that point, words stop being something you use to describe your life and become something you use to define the direction it is already moving toward. Not in a loud or dramatic way, but in a quiet consistency that, over time, becomes undeniable, because what you repeatedly declare, you eventually become aligned with, and what you align with consistently begins to take form around you. You can apply every method you have learned, refine your thoughts, choose your words carefully, imagine the outcome with precision, hold your attention with discipline, and still feel that something is missing, as if the process is technically correct but not fully alive, as if you are doing everything right and yet something is not flowing the way it should. And that missing element is not another technique, not another strategy, but something far more fundamental, something that determines whether everything you do remains effort or becomes alignment. What you have been calling love is often reduced to emotion, to attraction, to preference, to something that rises and falls depending on circumstances. But that is not the force being pointed to here, because the kind of love that transforms experience is not dependent on conditions. It is not selective. It is not transactional. It is not something you give only when something meets your expectations. It is a state of openness that dissolves resistance, a way of perceiving that removes separation, a quality of awareness that allows what you are aligning with to move without obstruction. When there is resistance, nothing flows easily, because resistance creates tension, and tension distorts perception. It narrows your focus. It amplifies what feels wrong. It reinforces the idea that something is missing or broken. And from that state, every thought you hold, every word you speak, every image you imagine is filtered through contraction, which means even your attempts to create something different are still rooted in the awareness of what is not working. Love removes that contraction, not by changing the external situation immediately, but by changing your relationship to it, by allowing you to see without immediate judgment, by allowing you to experience without needing to control every detail, by allowing you to remain open even when things are not yet aligned with what you prefer. And that openness is not weakness. It is clarity, because it frees you from reacting automatically and allows you to respond from a deeper level of awareness. You cannot create freely while you are resisting what is, because resistance anchors you to the very thing you are trying to move beyond. Every time you reject your current state, every time you fight against what you are experiencing, every time you define something as wrong or unacceptable, you tighten your identification with it. You reinforce its presence in your awareness. You give it more attention, more energy, more continuity, and even if you are trying to replace it with something better, that underlying resistance continues to shape your perception, keeping you connected to what you say you do not want. Love does not mean you approve of everything. It means you stop resisting the fact that something is present. And in that acceptance, you release the tension that was holding it in place. This is why acceptance is not passive. It is transformative, because when you are no longer pushing against your experience, you create space. And in that space, your awareness becomes clearer, your perception becomes less distorted, and your ability to align with something new becomes stronger. Not because you forced it, but because you removed what was blocking it. Love is what allows the process to move. Without it, everything becomes rigid, effortful, controlled, and ultimately limited by the very tension you are holding. But with it, Something shifts, not outside you first, but within you, in the way you relate to everything that appears, in the way you interpret what is happening, in the way you respond to yourself, because the way you relate to yourself is where this force becomes most visible. If you constantly judge yourself, criticize your thoughts, reject your emotions, define yourself through your mistakes, you create an internal environment that is restrictive, that is heavy, that is resistant to change, because every attempt to move forward is filtered through a sense of not being enough, of needing to fix something before you can become something else. But when you allow yourself to be where you are without turning it into a fixed identity, when you stop attacking yourself for what you feel, when you recognize that your current state is not your definition but your experience, something softens, and that softness is not weakness. It is flexibility. It is the ability to shift without force, to move without resistance, to align without struggle. From that place, everything you have learned begins to work differently. Your thoughts become lighter, not because you are forcing positivity, but because you are no longer feeding negativity through resistance. Your words carry more clarity, not because you are controlling them, but because they are no longer shaped by tension. Your imagination becomes more vivid, not because you are trying harder, but because you are not contradicting it with doubt and fear at the same time. Love integrates everything. It allows your inner world to function as a coherent system instead of a fragmented one. And this is why it is the fundamental creative force, not because it replaces everything else, but because it allows everything else to operate without distortion, without conflict, without the constant interference of resistance. You do not need to manufacture this state. It is already available to you. It appears the moment you stop tightening, the moment you stop pushing against what is present, the moment you allow yourself to experience without immediately judging, correcting, or rejecting. And in that moment, even briefly, you begin to notice that something within you is not disturbed, not reactive, not limited by what is happening on the surface. That is where creation becomes effortless, not because you are doing less, but because you are no longer working against yourself. And as you return to that state more consistently, as you begin to live from that openness instead of from resistance, something becomes clear in a way that does not require explanation. Because you are no longer trying to create from lack. You are allowing what you align with to emerge without being blocked by the tension you once held. And from there, everything you once struggled to force begins to move with a kind of ease that feels unfamiliar at first, but eventually becomes natural. Because you are no longer divided within yourself. You have been trying to move forward while still carrying what you never released. And no matter how much you learn, no matter how clearly you begin to understand the principles of creation, there is a quiet weight that follows you, something unresolved that continues to shape how you see yourself, how you trust, how you expect life to respond to you. And that weight is not always obvious, because it hides inside memory, inside emotion, inside the way you interpret your past and silently project it into your future. What you call faith often feels like something you must build, something you must strengthen, something you must convince yourself to hold on to even when there is no evidence. But faith in its true form is not forced belief. It is not something you create by repeating words until you feel stable. It is the natural result of alignment, a quiet certainty that emerges when your inner world is no longer divided against itself, when what you think, what you feel, and what you assume are no longer pulling in different directions. But that alignment cannot stabilize while you are still holding on to unresolved tension, because every unresolved experience becomes a reference point. Every memory you have not released continues to influence how you interpret what is happening now. And without realizing it, you begin to expect the future to resemble the past, not because it must, but because you are still seeing through the same emotional lens, still reacting from the same place, still identifying with the same patterns that were formed before you became aware of them. This is why forgiveness is not about the other person. It is about what you are still carrying, because as long as you hold on to resentment, to blame, to the sense that something should not have happened the way it did, you remain connected to it, not externally, but internally, and that connection continues to shape your perception, continues to influence your reactions, continues to define the way you see yourself and others. You may think you have moved on, But if the emotional charge is still there, if the memory still triggers a reaction, if the story still feels unresolved, then it is not in the past. It is active. It is part of your present awareness. And anything that is active within you becomes part of the structure that shapes your experience. Forgiveness is not approval. It is release. It is the decision to stop carrying what no longer serves you. Not because it was right, not because it was fair, but because holding on to it keeps you anchored to a version of yourself that was shaped in that moment. And as long as you remain anchored there, your ability to align with something new is limited. You cannot fully step into a new identity while you are still emotionally tied to an old one. And that tie is not broken by time. It is broken by awareness, by seeing clearly that what you are holding on to is not protecting you. It is restricting you, not because it has power on its own, but because you continue to give it space, continue to revisit it, continue to define yourself in relation to it. When you release that, something changes immediately, not in your external world, but in your internal structure, in the way you perceive, in the way you respond, in the way you feel about yourself. And that shift creates the conditions for something else to stabilize, something that was always there but could not fully emerge while you were still holding on to the past. This is where faith becomes natural, not because you forced yourself to believe, but because there is no longer internal resistance contradicting what you are aligning with. Because once you release the emotional patterns that were reinforcing doubt, fear, and limitation, your awareness becomes clearer, your sense of direction becomes more stable, and what you once called faith begins to feel like knowing. You are no longer divided between what you want and what you expect. You are no longer pulled between past experience and present possibility. You are no longer trying to believe something new while still emotionally committed to something old. And in that coherence, faith does not need to be maintained. It sustains itself. Because faith is not about ignoring reality. It is about seeing beyond what is currently visible without being contradicted by your own internal state. When your inner world is clear, when your past is no longer shaping your present through unresolved tension, when your identity is no longer defined by what you have been through, you begin to trust differently. Not because you are forcing yourself to, but because there is nothing inside you actively opposing that trust. This is where healing happens, not as a dramatic event, not as something you achieve once and never revisit, but as a gradual release of everything that was never meant to define you in the first place. As a quiet reorganization of your inner world where what was once heavy becomes lighter, where what was once reactive becomes still, where what was once fragmented becomes coherent, you begin to see your past differently, not as something that defines you, but as something that you experienced, something that shaped certain patterns that you are no longer required to repeat, something that can be understood without being carried. And as that shift deepens, your relationship with yourself changes. You stop judging your reactions. You stop resisting your emotions. You stop defining yourself through your mistakes. You allow yourself to be in the process of change without needing to be perfect before you can move forward. And in that allowance, something opens, a space where you are no longer fighting yourself, a space where you are no longer divided, a space where alignment becomes possible. Because alignment does not happen when everything outside of you is perfect. It happens when everything inside of you is no longer in conflict. And from that place, faith is no longer something you reach for. It is something you stand on, not because you decided to believe, but because there is nothing left within you that contradicts what you are choosing to become. You thought this journey would end with you, your clarity, your freedom, your ability to shape your life the way you once believed was impossible. But something begins to shift the moment you actually start to align, not as an idea, but as a lived experience. Because what you once wanted for yourself no longer feels separate from everything around you. And the more stable your inner state becomes, the less your focus stays confined to personal outcomes, and the more naturally it expands into something wider, something that includes others without effort, without obligation, without needing to be told. Manifestation, as you have understood it so far, may have felt personal, a way to improve your circumstances, to move beyond limitation, to experience more ease, more abundance, more freedom. And there is nothing wrong with that, because it is often where awareness begins. But if it ends there, it remains incomplete, because the same consciousness that allows you to create for yourself does not stop at the boundary of your individual life. It continues. It expresses. It extends. And when you are no longer resisting it, it moves through you in ways that are no longer centered only on what you can receive, but on what you can allow to flow. Abundance is not something you collect. It is something you participate in. And the moment you begin to see it that way, your relationship with it changes, because you are no longer trying to secure it, no longer trying to hold on to it, no longer measuring yourself by how much of it you can accumulate. You begin to recognize that abundance is not a fixed amount, not a limited resource, but a state of openness that allows movement, that allows exchange, that allows energy to circulate instead of stagnate. When you were operating from lack, everything felt like something to protect, something to defend, something that could be lost. And from that position, even when you gained something, there was tension, because you were still relating to it as if it could disappear, still holding it with fear, still defining yourself through whether you had enough or not. But when your awareness shifts, when your identity is no longer tied to scarcity, something relaxes, and in that relaxation, your actions change, your decisions change, your presence changes. You are no longer taking from the world, you are moving with it. This is where manifestation becomes effortless, not because you stop participating, but because you are no longer divided internally, no longer contradicting what you are aligning with, no longer trying to create from a place of tension. And because of that, what flows into your life does not feel forced. It feels natural. It feels consistent with the state you have stabilized within yourself. But something else begins to emerge at this stage, something that cannot be ignored once you become aware of it. Because the more you align internally, the more you realize that what you have access to is not meant to be contained, not meant to be held in isolation, not meant to stop at your own experience. Because the same awareness that allows you to shift your reality also allows you to influence the way others experience theirs. Not through control, not through force, but through presence, through the way you show up, through the way you interact, through the energy you bring into every space you enter. You begin to notice that your state affects others, not in a dramatic way, not always in ways that can be measured, but in subtle shifts, in how people respond to you, in how situations unfold around you, in how conversations take shape. And this is not because you are trying to change anyone, but because alignment has a natural influence. Coherence has a stabilizing effect. And when you are no longer operating from fear, from lack, from reaction, you create a different environment simply by being in it. This is where service begins. But not as something you are told to do, not as a responsibility imposed on you, but as a natural extension of who you have become. Because when you are no longer consumed by your own lack, when you are no longer trying to fix yourself, when you are no longer focused only on what you need to get, your awareness expands. And in that expansion, you begin to see others differently, not as obstacles, not as competitors, not as separate from you, but as part of the same field you are moving within. You no longer ask, "What can I take from this?" but "What can move through me here?" And that shift changes everything. Because service is not about giving away what you have. It is about allowing what you are aligned with to express itself beyond you, whether that is through your words, your actions, your presence, or simply the way you hold space for others without judgment, without projection, without needing to fix them. You become a point of stability in a world that often feels unstable. You become a reflection of possibility in environments that are used to limitation. And without trying to convince anyone, without needing to explain what you are doing, you begin to influence, not by force, but by alignment, not by effort, but by consistency. This is where the journey completes itself in a way that cannot be planned. Because what started as a desire to change your own life becomes a way of being that naturally contributes to something larger, something that extends beyond your individual experience, something that moves through you rather than stopping at you. And the more you allow that movement, the more you realize that nothing you have aligned with is diminished by sharing it. Nothing you have become is reduced by expressing it. Because abundance, in its true form, does not decrease when it flows. It expands. You are not here to hold everything for yourself. You are here to participate in something that continues through you. And once you see that clearly, even without needing to define it, something settles in a way that does not need explanation, because you are no longer trying to create only for yourself. You are allowing what you have aligned with to move freely, to reach beyond you, to take form in ways you do not need to control, because the process you have come to understand is no longer something you use occasionally. It is something you live within, and from that place, what you once called manifestation is no longer a goal. It is simply the way your life unfolds.